The forest still remembers. It remembers the screams that were swallowed by moss, the clash of iron that dissolved into rain, and the banners that once gleamed with Rome's golden eagle, now rotting beneath black soil. When the wind sighs through the skeletal trees, it carries an echo of men who vanished in terror, leaving behind only their bones and the silence of defeat. No empire should have died here, in the damp, shadowed throat of Germania, yet 3 legions did. And behind that impossible victory stood not only a man who betrayed an empire, but a woman who defied her blood to follow him. Long before his name became a battle cry, Arminius had worn Rome's armor like a second skin. Born among the Cherushi in 17 BCE, he had been taken as a child across the Rhine, a hostage gifted to the empire that threatened to devour his homeland. In Rome, they called such children guarantees of peace. But they were not children to Rome. They were clay to be molded into Romans, stripped of wildness and memory, shaped by marble discipline. Arminius was shaped better than most. He absorbed their language, their drills, their rituals. He rose swiftly through the ranks, first among the auxilia, then into the Roman equestrian order, earning citizenship and the trust of generals who saw him not as a Germanic captive, but as a Roman prodigy with northern blood. They never noticed how his eyes lingered on the horizon whenever he stood atop a Roman fortress, looking northward, toward the forest beyond the Rhine. They did not know that in his dreams he walked barefoot through mist, hearing voices whisper his name in a tongue Rome had tried to scour from him. He smiled when they called him loyal. He saluted when they hailed him as a son of Rome. But he belonged to the forest, and the forest was patient. Far from the marble forms where Arminius learned to march, a young woman grew among the Cherushi, a daughter of power, raised inside the old rhythms of her people. Her name was Thusnelda. She lived in a world Rome considered barbaric. No temples of stone, no roads of engineered precision, no Senate decrees or gilded statuary. But she knew another kind of order, one woven from bloodlines, oaths, and sacred groves, where sunlight pierced the canopy like spears. Her father, Segestes, taught her the logic of survival in the shadow of the empire. Bow to Rome, trade with Rome, marry into Rome's favor. He believed resistance was madness, that to defy the eagle was to be crushed beneath its talons. He dressed her in silk from Roman merchants and spoke of her duty to secure their family's future through obedience. But Thusnelda's heart belonged not to marble but to earth. She walked barefoot in the sacred groves, pressing her palms into the cold soil, listening to the ground hum with the voices of her ancestors. She saw Rome's iron creeping across the rivers like frost. And though she smiled when Roman envoys passed, something in her eyes stayed wild, untamed, refusing to bend. When Arminius returned to Germania, it was not as the boy who had been taken, but as the man Rome had built, disciplined, scarred, and draped in imperial honors. The Cherushi chieftains received him as an ally, even as they whispered doubts. He spoke Latin as easily as his native tongue. He rode with Roman bearing, carried Roman steel, and smiled with Roman calm. Yet as he crossed the river into the shadow of the ancient forest, something old stirred in him. The air here was different, thicker, damp with memory. The trees rose like pillars of a forgotten cathedral, and the ground smelled of moss and blood. Every step felt like coming home and trespassing at once. The land had changed in his absence. Roman forts stood along the Rhine like stone teeth. Merchants brought wine and coin deep into the tribal heartlands. Roman magistrates rode among the villages, collecting tribute and judging disputes as if they owned the air itself. Segestes welcomed them, offered feasts, and praised Roman law as the path to peace. Many nodded, some muttered, all feared. Rome's shadow grew longer each season. Thusnelda saw him first not as a savior nor a traitor, but as a fracture in the pattern. He moved like Rome, but his eyes searched like hers, scanning the tree line as though listening for something lost. Their first meeting passed without words. He stood in her father's hall, silent among the boasting chiefs, and for an instant their eyes caught. There was no smile, only recognition, sharp and sudden, like flint striking flint. She looked away before her father noticed. But that night, she could not stop hearing the faint rhythm of his boots echoing on Roman stone, nor shake the thought that he carried the forest in his shadow, even as he wore the empire on his skin. Arminius studied her with the same quiet intensity he gave the terrain. She was unlike the Roman women he had known. No painted lips or choreographed laughter, but a stillness that felt ancient, rooted like an oak. When she spoke, it was with the precision of a blade. When she laughed rarely, it was like distant thunder. He saw in her not softness, but the raw iron of the land he had left behind. And something in him, long dormant, began to ache. He told himself she was dangerous. She was the daughter of Segestes, Rome's most loyal friend among the Cherushi. She was bound to be offered as a political bride to secure alliances. To look at her too long was to tempt ruin. Yet he found himself watching, again and again, as if she were a signal from the world he had buried to survive. Rome, meanwhile, watched him as their perfect instrument. Varus, the Roman governor, believed Arminius would be the key to pacifying Germania at last. He trusted the young commander utterly. He could not imagine that this man might dream of something older than empire, something wild, rooted and patient, something that whispered to him at night in the voice of the forest, and soon in the voice of Thusnelda. The world seemed poised on a knife edge, though no one saw it yet. To the Romans, Arminius was their triumph. To Segestes, Thusnelda was his legacy. To the Cherushi, submission to Rome seemed inevitable. Only the forest knew that all these certainties were already rotting at the root, and within that quiet decay, two fates were drifting toward collision, a man who had forgotten his soul and a woman who refused to surrender hers. The forest was watching. The empire was asleep. Something was about to awaken. Before he ever set foot back in the shadowed forests of his birth, Arminius belonged to another world entirely, a world carved in marble, humming with the disciplined heartbeat of empire. Rome had swallowed him young, and in swallowing him, believed it had remade him. To the Romans, this was mercy, a barbarian child sculpted into civilization, given the gift of order. To Arminius, it had been exile dressed as honor. They brought him first to the capital, where the air itself seemed to glitter. He remembered the first time he stood on the steps of the Forum, staring up at the stone faces of dead conquerors frozen in triumph. Rome was a machine of eternity, its buildings thrusting into the sky like defiance made stone. Its people moved in perfect rhythm, senators in scarlet-edged togas, soldiers in bronze, slaves flowing like water through the streets. He learned their tongue until he dreamed in it. He learned their rituals, their laws, their logic. They taught him that to be Roman was to dominate chaos, to bend the unruly world into the shape of their will. In this he excelled. He studied under centurions hardened by campaigns from Africa to Hispania, men who believed fear was a disease cured only by obedience. He became swift, precise, implacable. He learned to fight not with passion but with calculation, to hold the shield wall as if it were an extension of his ribs, to strike in measured rhythm like the tolling of a bell. They made him an officer among the auxilia, those provincial troops who bled for Rome in distant provinces. He marched in Thrace, bled in the Balkan highlands, watched hill forts burn as Roman standards rose smoking above them. Each victory etched Rome deeper into his flesh. Each corpse blurred the memory of the boy who had once walked barefoot among the oaks of the Weser. Yet even as he rose, something remained unclaimed inside him, a quiet hollow untouched by Roman marble. It stirred only at night, when the camps fell silent and he gazed toward the northern horizon. In his dreams, he saw green shadows and heard voices speaking the old tongue, the syllables braided with wind and wolf song. He would wake gripping his gladius, the campfire painting Roman red across his knuckles, and tell himself it was only memory, only the remnants of a childhood too distant to matter. Rome was his home now. Rome had made him strong. Rome had given him everything. And still, Rome never called him son. He was praised but never embraced, celebrated but never trusted without a chain of duty around his neck. He noticed the way patrician officers smiled too thinly, how they spoke of our people, with a line of separation that always placed him on the other side. He was not Roman. He was Rome's weapon, sharpened to be used and set aside. They could polish a barbarian, but they could not forget what he was. The realization lodged deep, like a splinter beneath the bone. While Arminius was being forged in Rome's fire, Thusnelda was being braided into the living roots of her homeland. Her world could not have been more different. Not marble but timber, not law but oath. The Cherushi lived in sprawling wooden halls ringed by palisades, their lives governed by honor older than empire. She was the pride of her father Segestes, who whispered to her from childhood that survival meant bending, not breaking. He taught her to speak Latin, to read Roman coinage, and mimic Roman ceremony, because he believed Rome's shadow was eternal, and one survived shadows by learning to walk within them. He dressed her in dyed linens from traders along the Rhine, paraded her at feasts before Roman envoys, promising she would one day be the bond that tied their people to the empire. But Thusnelda felt no awe when the Romans came riding with their polished armor and their clipped smiles. She watched their eyes, not their gold. She saw how they looked at her people as if measuring them, as if deciding how many might be spared. She saw her father's smile stiffen like frost when the Romans praised his loyalty, and how his hands clenched unseen beneath the feasting table. Rome spoke of peace while planting fortresses. It offered protection like a wolf offering shelter to lambs. Even as a child, Thusnelda understood the bargain her father sought, safety at the price of submission. And somewhere inside she recoiled. She found her refuge in the sacred groves, ancient clearings where the trees grew so high the sky became only a narrow blade of light. The old women said the gods dwelled there, older than Rome, older than stone. Thusnelda would walk alone among the trunks, the air damp and still, and press her ear to the earth. Sometimes she thought she could feel it breathing, slow and deep, as if the land itself slept lightly, waiting. She carried that silence inside her like an amulet, even when wrapped in Roman silk. It reminded her who she was beneath the disguises her father draped across her shoulders. As the years turned, Rome's presence thickened along the Rhine. Fortresses multiplied, roads spread like veins. Tax collectors arrived with wax tablets and armed escorts. Some Cherushi chiefs welcomed them, eager for Roman coin. Others seethed but hid their fury behind smiles. Segestes thrived in this new world. He feasted the governors, praised Roman law, spoke of a future where Germania would be tamed and prosperous. He saw rebellion as extinction, obedience as survival. To him, Thusnelda was a piece on the board, a bride to be traded for political safety, her will irrelevant. But Thusnelda was not made to be traded. She learned to listen without speaking, to memorize every word and weigh its hidden shape. She saw the cracks no one else acknowledged, the tribes who hated each other more than they feared Rome, the Roman officers who despised their allies even as they depended on them. She sensed that Rome's power was not invincible, only colossal, only brittle, only unaware that the ground beneath its feet still belonged to the forest. It was into this tension that Arminius returned, draped in Roman glory. He came bearing citizenship, a commander's rank, and the polished discipline of Rome's legions. To Segestes, he was proof that cooperation worked, a barbarian remade as a Roman. To most Cherushi, he was unsettling, their own blood moving with alien precision, speaking their language with Roman cadence. They welcomed him as an honored son, yet watched him like a hawk watches a tamed wolf, unsure if its teeth had truly been filed down. Thusnelda watched him too, but not with fear. She watched him the way one watches a thundercloud forming at the horizon, fascinated, wary, unable to look away. He carried Rome like armor, but beneath it she glimpsed something restless, something coiled and waiting. He stood apart at feasts, silent as others boasted, his gaze always drawn to the tree line, as though listening to something only he could hear. When he spoke, it was measured, elegant, honed. When he smiled, it never reached his eyes. He noticed her as well, not at first as a woman, but as a disruption. The only stillness in a hall full of motion, the only gaze that did not avert from his. She did not fawn, did not flatter, did not fear him. She looked at him like a question, and in that gaze he felt something dangerous shift inside him. He had buried the boy who belonged to the forest. She made him wonder if that boy still breathed. Rome believed it owned him. Germania believed it had lost him. But Arminius was beginning to understand that he belonged to neither. Not yet. He was a blade suspended between two whetstones, and one of them had just flared with sparks. What neither of them knew, not Arminius, not Thusnelda, not the empire itself, was that this unspoken recognition would become the fault line along which Rome's dreams would shatter. In the silence between their first glances, the forest stirred. It began as a shadow, small enough to hide, soft enough to dismiss. A glance held a heartbeat too long, a silence between them that hummed louder than speech. In the halls of the Cherushi, where oaths and rivalries clashed like swords, Arminius and Thusnelda moved around each other like predators, circling the same invisible wound. They should have been enemies by instinct, by blood, by the invisible walls built between their lives. Yet the current between them only tightened until ignoring it felt more dangerous than surrendering. Arminius had come back to his people cloaked in Rome's glory, but in her presence he felt it cracking like sun-baked clay. Thusnelda carried the forest in her breath. She did not seek him, yet she did not flee his gaze, and that unsettled him more than hatred would have. He was accustomed to admiration, suspicion, even fear. But she offered neither shield nor submission, only the quiet defiance of someone who could not be bent. It made him restless, as if something buried deep within him had stirred awake and was clawing toward the surface. For Thusnelda, he was a paradox that refused to resolve. He moved with Rome's precision, spoke in Rome's tongue, and yet when he stood at the edge of the sacred grove, his stillness belonged to the land itself. He carried the rhythm of marching drums in his stride, but his eyes searched the horizon like a hunter born of mist. She told herself he was dangerous. He was her father's prized ally, the living symbol of Segestes' belief that submission could bring survival. Touching him would be touching the heart of everything she despised about Rome. And yet, when he passed, the air seemed to bend. Their first true conversation was not words but absence. It happened at a feast, the hall thick with firelight and mead. Chiefs shouted, laughed, clashed cups. Segestes beamed as Roman envoys nodded politely, enduring the barbarian revelry. Arminius stood apart as always, silent, sipping wine with the poise of marble. Thusnelda slipped out into the night, seeking air. The sky was black glass. Stars hung like cold nails. She heard him follow but did not turn. They stood side by side on the wooden walkway overlooking the dark forest, not speaking, their breath clouding in the same rhythm. The silence between them was not empty. It was charged, humming like the moment before a storm breaks. It was not love yet. Love is soft. This was something sharper, forged from friction and impossibility. When their eyes met, it was not tenderness she saw, but hunger. The hunger of someone who had been starving for something unnamed. It terrified her. It also rooted her feet to the earth. Over the weeks that followed, they found excuses to linger near one another. Too brief to notice if you weren't looking, too constant to be chance if you were. A comment passed like a blade's edge, testing the other's armor. A glance across the council fire, quickly withdrawn. They spoke of trivial things in public, weather, horses, Roman customs. But beneath each word ran the unspoken question, what are you? She learned pieces of him like shards from a shattered mask. How he had been taken from their homeland as a boy, trained to fight wars that were not his. How Rome had clothed him in honor, but never warmth. How he had risen by bearing the part of himself that remembered the sound of these forests. He did not say he hated Rome. He said nothing of hatred at all. But his silence when others praised the empire was heavier than any curse. He carried Rome's discipline as armor, but inside it, she saw a fracture glowing like embers. He learned her like a map of forbidden territory. How she walked barefoot in the sacred groves, pressing her palms to the soil as if listening for something deep below. How she spoke softly but left no space for dismissal. How she smiled rarely, and only when she meant it. He saw the quiet fury she hid from her father, the rage at seeing her people bowed by Roman yokes disguised as treaties. She was loyal to the forest in a way Rome could never understand. It drew him like gravity. Their closeness could not stay hidden forever. Segestes saw the glances. He saw the silence, which was more dangerous than words. He confronted Thusnelda one night, his voice low but sharp, warning her that Arminius was Rome's creature, a snake wrapped in gold. He told her that her duty was to their family, to marry as he commanded, to bind their bloodline to Rome's protection. She listened, eyes lowered, hands still. But when he finished, she said nothing. And in her silence, Segestes felt the first thread of control snap. Arminius too heard the whispers. Allies warned him that touching Segestes' daughter would shatter the fragile balance he had built, that to bind himself to her would brand him a traitor in both worlds, a rebel among Romans, a pawn among Germans. He nodded, pretended agreement. But each night, when the campfires guttered out and the forest breathed in darkness, her face came to him like moonlight on water, unreachable and therefore irresistible. They tried to resist. It lasted days. Desire, once named, cannot be buried again. They met in the grove, the place where the old gods were said to sleep. The air was cold, the moss damp beneath their knees. There were no vows, no witnesses, only hands gripping as though the earth itself might pull them apart. It was not gentle. It was not safe. It was inevitable. By dawn, the world had changed. They did not speak of marriage, but something older than ceremony had already bound them. When they emerged from the grove, the forest felt different, alive, alert, as if it too had sensed what they had done. They returned to their people, outwardly unchanged, but every gesture between them now carried the weight of defiance. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The news broke like thunder. When Segestes learned, his fury was cold and lethal. He denounced Arminius before the tribal council, accusing him of seducing his daughter to disgrace their bloodline. He demanded she be returned to him and punished. Thusnelda stood before him, her face carved from stone, and refused. She declared she would remain with Arminius as his wife, not as property to be given or reclaimed. Gasps rippled through the hall. To defy a father was unthinkable. To defy Segestes was perilous. To do it for a man Rome had claimed as its own was nothing short of rebellion. Segestes stormed from the hall, swearing vengeance. The tribe split like a fractured bone. Some whispered that Thusnelda had betrayed her people by marrying Rome's favorite. Others whispered that Arminius had betrayed Rome by marrying the fiercest heart of Germania. Both were correct, and both were wrong. They had not chosen politics. They had chosen each other, and politics had chosen to burn around them. For Arminius, the choice marked a point of no return. Rome would see his union with Thusnelda not as love, but as sedition, a barbarian reclaiming barbarian blood. The Cherushi elites would see it as ambition, a bid to seize Segestes' influence. He understood the risk. He also understood that he no longer cared. With her beside him, the world's chains felt breakable. Rome's might felt finite. The forest no longer whispered, it roared. That winter, they lived as outcasts in plain sight, present at councils yet peripheral, tolerated yet distrusted. Segestes refused to speak her name. Roman envoys avoided their table. But beneath the isolation, something was coiling, tightening, sharpening. For the first time, Arminius began to speak not only of resisting Rome's laws, but of breaking Rome itself. And as he spoke, Thusnelda listened with eyes like flint, seeing not madness, but inevitability. Their love was not gentle. It was a spark struck between flint and steel, born of collision, destined to set the world alight. And far away, Rome celebrated its endless dominion, unaware that in a cold forest, a woman and a man had just torn open the first crack in its immortal facade. Winter passed like a drawn breath. And when spring thawed the forest, the world around Arminius and Thusnelda had shifted in ways invisible to Rome, but clear as blood to those who could feel the pulse of the land. Their marriage had marked them as outcasts, yet it had also made them something else. Dangerous, unbound by the chains that held others still. They no longer belonged to Segestes' orbit or to Rome's illusions. They belonged only to each other, and to the growing certainty that Germania could not live with Rome's shadow forever pressing down upon its chest. The empire had grown complacent. Its legions strutted through the tribal lands with their banners gleaming and their discipline polished like mirrors. Roman magistrates came draped in red-edged togas, speaking of law and order, as if they were gifts from Olympus. They collected taxes in grain, seized hostages as guarantees, redrew borders without asking the names of the rivers they carved through. To Rome, Germania was not a land of people. It was a blank space awaiting the mapmaker's ink. Arminius knew better. He had worn their armor, marched to their cadence, killed at their command. He knew their arrogance was their heartbeat and their blindness was their pulse. Rome believed obedience was inevitable because it had never tasted true wilderness, never fought an enemy who did not fear death enough to bow. Germania was not a province waiting to be named. It was an ancient animal, coiled and silent, patient as frost. Rome could not tame it. Rome could only awaken it. It was Thusnelda who first gave shape to the thought that haunted Arminius at night. One evening they sat alone by the dying embers of their hearth, the world outside muffled in snow. He spoke of the tribes, how they bickered over cattle while Rome fortified its roads, how they traded daughters for trinkets while Roman tax ledgers thickened like vines. They will not rise, he murmured, because they do not believe they can win. Thusnelda watched the fire crackle down to ash. Then make them believe, she said quietly. Burn the illusion before you burn the empire. Something in him went still. He turned to her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the woman he loved, but as the soul of the forest itself speaking through human lips. In that moment, the rebellion ceased to be a fantasy and became a plan. The plan did not begin with swords. It began with whispers. Arminius wove himself deeper into the confidence of Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor of Germania. Varus was a man of noble birth and administrative arrogance, more accustomed to courtrooms than battlefields. He believed Germania had already been conquered in spirit, that only paperwork remained. To him, Arminius was the perfect instrument, a Germanic prince polished by Roman discipline, loyal, eloquent, invaluable. Arminius fed that illusion with careful obedience. He attended Varus's councils, translated tribal disputes, offered advice with the tone of humility Rome adored. He became indispensable. Behind that mask, he began to build his trap. While Varus rode the new Roman roads and lectured tribes on Roman law, Arminius traveled quietly through the forest paths Rome had never mapped. He met with chieftains in hidden clearings, men who had once been rivals or even enemies. Some came sneering, expecting another Roman puppet speech. Arminius offered them something else. Not tribute, not treaties, but vengeance. He spoke of the endless taxes, the hostages Rome took as collateral, the humiliation of watching their sons march under Roman banners. He did not offer them glory. He offered them release from the slow suffocation of empire, from the slow erasure of their gods and their language and their pride. Most laughed, some cursed, a few listened. Thusnelda worked where no sword could reach. She knew the rhythms of the tribal feasts, the tangled loyalties of bloodlines, the grudges older than Rome itself. While Arminius spoke to warriors, she spoke to their wives, their mothers, their sisters. She carried words like seeds, planting doubt in soil no Roman had ever seen. She reminded them what it meant to belong to the land, not to an empire that measured them like livestock. She moved quietly, always invisible, yet slowly the ground beneath Rome began to shift. Still, it was not enough. The tribes feared Rome more than they hated it. They had seen rebellion crushed before. They had seen villages burned to ash, children marched away in chains. What Arminius proposed was not a raid or a protest, it was annihilation. To convince them, he would need more than promises. He would need to become the forest's chosen blade. All the while, Varus remained blind. He issued decrees as if words could bind soil, lectured on Roman law to men who barely concealed their scorn, and tightened Rome's grip with the oblivious confidence of someone holding a snake by the tail. He believed Arminius to be his most loyal ally. When reports came of unrest among the tribes, Arminius was the one he sent to soothe them. Arminius returned with calm words and false assurances, each lie tightening the snare. The plan crystallized in late summer of the year 9 CE. Varus prepared to march 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, through the Teutoburg Forest to show the flag among the tribes. It would be a routine display of force, the kind Rome excelled at, banners high, armor gleaming, drums beating discipline into the mud. Arminius saw it for what it was, a gift. The Teutoburg was not a forest. It was a labyrinth of ravines, swamps, entangled oaks older than Rome's myths. Rain turned its paths to rivers of clay. Fog erased distance, swallowed sound. Roads twisted like veins and narrowed to deer tracks between cliffs of dripping moss. A Roman column could not march there. It could only crawl, stretched into a thin, gasping line. That was where they would die. In secret councils by firelight, Arminius laid out his design. They would let the legions enter the forest in full pomp, then strike like the land itself had risen to devour them. Cut the column into fragments. Collapse trees across the path to trap wagons. Strike the rear, vanish. Strike the flanks, vanish. Never giving the legions time to form their iron wall. The forest would be their ally, the mud their weapon. The Romans would not be beaten in battle. They would be drowned in chaos. Thusnelda watched from the shadows of these councils, saying little. Her presence an unspoken axis around which Arminius's fury revolved. When the men faltered, when doubts rose like smoke, she steadied him with a single look. She reminded him, silently, what was at stake. Not glory, not revenge, but the survival of their world. By late summer, the alliances were forged. Cherushi, Bructeri, Chatti, Marsi, and others swore temporary unity, bound not by trust but by desperation. They hid their warriors in the woods like coals buried in ash. Still, there was risk. One wrong word, one rumor reaching Varus, and all would burn before it began. Segestes nearly ruined everything. Sensing the storm, he went secretly to Varus and warned him that Arminius was plotting treachery. Varus dismissed him with a smile, certain the old man was blinded by jealousy over losing his daughter to Rome's favorite. It was his last chance to save his legions. He let it slip through his fingers. As the legions prepared to march, Thusnelda stood alone at the edge of the sacred grove. The sky was low, swollen with storm. The wind curled through the trees like breath through a sleeping giant's lungs. She pressed her palm to the earth and felt it humming, not with fear, but with hunger. Far off, Roman drums began to beat, slow and arrogant, echoing through the hills. The legions were coming. They did not know that the forest they marched into was no longer forest. It was a trap. It was an ambush stretched across miles, silent and waiting, as patient as the centuries Rome had thought it owned. Thusnelda closed her eyes and listened to the distant rhythm, imagining how quickly it would turn to screams. She thought of her father, who believed Rome eternal. She thought of her unborn child, who would inherit whatever world she and Arminius carved from the bones of this one. Then she opened her eyes. The wind shifted. The first drops of rain began to fall. Rome was walking into the jaws of the forest, and she would never see the world the same again. Rain fell like a curtain as the legions marched, the world narrowing to mud and iron. To the Romans, it was an inconvenience, another petty defiance of nature to be endured and overcome. To the forest, it was preparation, softening the earth, thickening the air, erasing the sun until even the most disciplined men began to forget what daylight felt like. Varus rode at the head of his column, surrounded by the ceremonial pomp he believed would awe the tribes into obedience. Banners sagged in the wet air, armor dulled under the endless drizzle, wagons groaned through the mire, axle deep, while engineers hacked at fallen trees and cursed the swamp. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions stretched like a silver serpent through the dripping green, their order fraying at the edges as they wound deeper into the Teutoburg. They did not know they were already inside a coffin. Arminius rode near the vanguard, face calm, eyes flicking to the tree line like a predator scenting the wind. He spoke easily with the Roman officers, joked about the weather, offered to scout the rumored unrest ahead. Varus waved him off at first, then agreed, pleased by his initiative. Arminius saluted with perfect Roman form, wheeled his horse, and vanished into the mist with his Germanic cavalry. He did not return. As the Roman column slogged forward, the forest began to change. The path narrowed, hemmed by steep ravines slick with moss. Trees crowded close, their trunks weeping rain like black candles. The canopy swallowed the sky. Visibility shrank to a few dozen paces. Marching formations collapsed into a crawling file. Heavy infantry tangled with wagons, engineers, camp followers, horses screaming as their hooves sank in bog. The rhythm of Rome dissolved. Then the forest screamed. It came from everywhere at once. A roar of horns, the shriek of war cries in a dozen tribal tongues, the beating of drums that sounded like the earth cracking open. Arrows hissed out of the mist. Spears whirled down from the trees. Stones crashed from the slopes. The Roman column buckled as if the forest itself had come alive and decided to kill. Arminius struck like lightning. His warriors erupted from the shadows, naked to the waist, their bodies streaked in clay, their eyes wild and bright. They hurled javelins, then vanished. They slammed felled trees across the path behind the Romans, cutting off retreat. They set fire to the wagons. They darted in to kill isolated groups, then melted away, leaving panic in their wake. Varus tried to rally the legions, barking orders that dissolved in the storm. Cohorts struggled to form ranks on ground that sucked at their sandals. Shields slipped in the rain. Bows refused to draw. The air was too wet for fire, too thick for breath. The famed Roman discipline, sharp, relentless, impenetrable on open ground, became useless here. The forest turned it to stone, heavy and slow, and then shattered it. For 3 days, the ambush never ceased. It was not a battle. It was dismemberment. Each night, the Romans tried to fortify their camps with ditches and palisades, but the ground turned to slime and collapsed. Each morning, the forest closed tighter. Arminius's men harried them from every side, striking the exhausted, the wounded, the rear guards burdened with supplies. Horses drowned in the bogs. Armor dragged men under when they slipped. The rain never stopped. By the 3rd day, the Roman line had ceased to exist. It was fragments, isolated knots of men stumbling through the dark, pursued by wolves in human form. Varus saw his command evaporate. He saw the eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, fall into the mud, trampled. He saw the eyes of his soldiers go hollow with the knowledge that Rome could not save them. And then, rather than be taken alive, he fell on his own sword. The legions dissolved. Thousands fled, throwing away shields and armor to run faster, only to be cut down from behind. A few escaped to Roman outposts weeks later, naked, raving, starving. Most vanished into the forest, their bones swallowed by the moss. By the time the storm passed, nothing remained of the 17th, 18th, or 19th legions, but scattered corpses and broken standards rotting in the mud. Rome would never again use those numbers. While the forest feasted, Thusnelda waited. She had not ridden with Arminius. Her place was elsewhere, unseen yet central. She remained at their hall, surrounded by silence, every hour a blade against her nerves. Messengers came sporadically, their words ragged, their eyes bright with disbelief. The Romans are faltering. They are trapped. They are dying. She said nothing, only listened. Her hands clenched so tightly the nails cut her palms. At night she walked alone into the sacred grove, barefoot in the wet moss, the air heavy with storm. She felt the forest vibrating, as if the land itself were groaning awake from centuries of slumber. She thought of her father, Segestes, who had sworn Rome eternal. She thought of the child stirring quietly within her, who would inherit whatever remained after this storm was spent. She thought of Arminius, somewhere out there in the darkness, wielding chaos like a blade. When the final messenger came, he did not speak. He only dropped to his knees, eyes wide, mud caked to his face like war paint. In his silence, she heard everything. Rome had been broken. The news spread like wildfire through the tribes. Feasts erupted, war dances shook the hills. Chiefs who had cowered for decades howled their joy to the sky. The empire that had called itself eternal had bled like any other creature. Even the river winds seemed to smell different. Sharp, electric, wild. Yet in the midst of that jubilation, Thusnelda stood apart. She did not smile. She could not. Victory was not relief. It was a cliff. They had destroyed Rome's illusion, but Rome itself still lived, and it would return with the fury of a wounded god. She knew this. She knew Arminius knew it too. That night, he came back to her. His body was streaked with dried blood and mud, his eyes fever bright. He said nothing when he entered, only sank to his knees before her like a man laid low by something heavier than exhaustion. She touched his face with trembling hands as if to convince herself he was still flesh and not some myth birthed from the storm. Outside, the forest was silent, as if listening. They had done the impossible. They had broken Rome. And in the silence that followed, Thusnelda understood the cost. They could never go back. The forest had claimed them now, and Rome would never forgive. The forest had swallowed 3 legions, and in their place it spat silence. The air seemed changed, sharper, charged like the moment after lightning strikes. Across the tribal lands, fires burned bright against the early autumn nights. The Cherushi and their allies feasted until the mead ran dry. Warriors painted their faces with Roman blood, and old songs thought forgotten rose from the earth like smoke. Children played at killing Romans. Elders whispered of omens fulfilled. Even the trees seemed to stand taller, their dripping boughs lifting toward the gray sky as if the land itself had shed a weight it had carried for centuries. And at the heart of that wild exultation stood Arminius and Thusnelda, draped not in silk or gold, but in something heavier, the gaze of history pressing down upon them like armor. The world saw them now not as man and woman, but as symbols. He the savior who shattered Rome's illusion of invincibility. She the fierce consort who had defied her blood to stand at his side. Their names traveled on wind, their faces burned in the minds of men who had never seen them. But victory is a brief and fickle creature. The forest gave them triumph. It did not grant them peace. The first cracks were almost invisible. They came as silences at councils, glances that lingered too long on Arminius's back. He had united the tribes through urgency, not loyalty, through hatred of Rome, not love for each other. Now that the great enemy lay broken, their old rivalries began to stir like adders under thawing snow. The Bructeri grumbled about spoils. The Chatti questioned why their warriors had bled so that the Cherushi could bask in glory. Even among the Cherushi, whispers coiled through the longhouses, that Arminius sought to crown himself king, that he would rule with Roman arrogance cloaked in Germanic pride. Thusnelda heard it all. She heard it in the pauses of speech, in the clenched jaws when Arminius entered a room, in the way the feast grew quieter as he passed. She said nothing, but she carried the knowledge like a blade between her ribs. She knew how quickly admiration curdled into fear, and fear into treachery. Arminius sensed it too, but he mistook it for petty jealousy, the natural spite of lesser men. He walked through their mutterings like through smoke, too high on the afterglow of triumph to taste the poison in the air. He had done what Rome thought impossible. He had ripped the eagle from its sky. He believed this gave him the right to shape the future. He spoke of forging a permanent confederation of the tribes, of building something enduring from their sudden unity. He dreamed aloud of laws, councils, even roads. Not Roman roads, but Germanic roads, carrying Germanic traders under Germanic banners. To Thusnelda, his words sounded like both hope and doom. She saw the flicker of Rome still burning inside him, the temptation to replace what he had destroyed, rather than let the forest remain untamed. She tried to warn him gently, to remind him that the tribes were not bricks to be mortared into a wall. They were rivers, wild and shifting, and if you dammed them, they would find ways to break through. He listened, nodded, kissed her forehead, and continued as before. Segestes, her father, moved like a shadow through this fragile world, his hatred sharpening as his power waned. He had lost his daughter, his prestige, and his standing with Rome. Yet he survived, biding his time like frost in the soil. He spoke softly now, no longer openly challenging Arminius, but his words dripped with venom disguised as wisdom. He told the chieftains that Arminius' victory had been luck, not genius, that Rome would return with fire and crush them all, and when it did, Arminius would flee back to his Roman masters and leave them to burn. He planted fear with the precision of a farmer sowing seeds. Thusnelda lived in a tightening vice. She tried to hold the fragile alliances together with soft hands where Arminius used iron. She visited rival chiefs, bearing gifts, invoking old kinship ties, reminding them that Rome was not yet dead. She spoke of their children's futures, of the forest still whispering for unity. Some listened. Most smiled and nodded and did nothing. They were drifting already back toward the comfortable gravity of their rivalries. Her own household mirrored the fracture. Arminius returned from councils with his jaw locked, his words curt. He paced like a caged wolf. He had begun to see betrayal in every shadow. Even his loyal companions felt the chill of his suspicion. Only with her did he soften, and even that was fleeting. He would rest his head in her lap, silent, eyes distant, as if seeing some horizon only he could glimpse. She would stroke his hair and say nothing, though fear knotted her throat. She could feel him slipping away, not from her love, but from himself, hollowed out by the weight of the crown he was trying to forge from thorn and blood. The world outside was already shifting. In Rome, Augustus raged. The Senate mourned not just the dead, but the humiliation, the shattering of Rome's myth of inevitability. In marble halls far from the dripping forest, the empire began to coil for vengeance. Tiberius, cold and deliberate, planned methodical retaliation. Germanicus, young and blazing, sharpened his sword with righteous fire. They would come. They would come not to conquer, but to punish, to erase the memory that Rome could be broken. Thusnelda sensed it even before the rumors reached them. She felt the tension in the air, the way the crows fell silent on certain mornings, the way the wind shifted as if carrying distant war drums. She told Arminius they had little time, that they must prepare the tribes before Rome's retaliation struck. He agreed, but too slowly, still believing his triumph had bought him a season of peace. It had bought him nothing. It had only painted a target on his heart. As autumn deepened, the discontent sharpened into defiance. The Marsi broke from the alliance, plundering Roman traders on their own and claiming the glory. The Chatti refused to send warriors for Arminius' new campaigns. Even within the Cherushi, old nobles muttered that he had grown too proud, too Roman. They remembered the boy who had left in chains and saw only the man who returned wrapped in Roman honors. They could not forgive him for becoming the thing he had destroyed, even as they stood on the bones of his victory. Thusnelda stood at the center of it all, her hands steady while her heart shook. She carried their unborn child inside her like a secret ember, and each night she wondered what kind of world she was bringing that child into. One of freedom, or one of ashes. She had chosen love, and in choosing it, had chosen rebellion. And in choosing rebellion, had chained herself to a destiny that now felt like a collapsing bridge. She began to walk again in the sacred grove. Though the air there no longer felt still, the trees seemed restless, their roots shifting under the soil as if the land itself was uneasy. She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth, searching for the steady heartbeat she had always felt before. This time it trembled. Arminius dreamed of building a nation from chaos, but Thusnelda knew the truth that gnawed like rot at the core of their triumph. The tribes had united not for him, not for freedom, but for the chance to tear Rome's throat. They had done it, and now they hungered for nothing but their old familiar feuds. And far to the south, Rome was stirring, its wrath slow but inexorable, like a glacier grinding down the mountains. Thusnelda rose from the grove, the cold earth clinging to her knees. The sky above was clear, sharp, mercilessly blue. Somewhere out there, beyond the forests and the rivers, the eagle was already turning back toward them, its wings black against the sun. Their victory was over. The real war had not yet begun. The snow had barely melted when the eagle returned. Rumors arrived first, thin as mist, drifting north on the tongues of traitors and spies. Rome was moving, legions massed along the Rhine, their camps swelling with fresh recruits and siege engines. Germanicus, the golden nephew of Tiberius, had been given command. Young, hungry, ablaze with the desire to cleanse Rome's shame and blood. He brought with him not just soldiers, but the fury of an empire humiliated before the world. They did not come to conquer. They came to erase. Arminius felt the tremor before he saw the storm. His dreams grew restless, crowded with the sound of marching feet. He spent his days fevered, racing from tribe to tribe, begging, threatening, coaxing them to hold the line. Some answered, many did not. The unity he had forged in the fire of Teutoburg was now ash, scattered by jealousies he could not mend. The Bructeri feuded with the Chatti. The Marsi pursued their own plunder. Even the Cherushi nobles whispered in corners, sharpening daggers in their minds. And moving like a viper through that chaos was Segestes. Her father had waited patiently through the months of Arminius' glory, smiling thinly while he was pushed to the margins. But hatred is patient when pride is wounded. Segestes saw what the others could not, that Rome was not broken, only wounded, and that wounds on empires heal into iron. He began to send secret messages to Germanicus, offering himself as an ally if the Romans would restore his power and crush the man who had stolen his daughter. Thusnelda sensed it before she heard the proof. She saw her father's gaze on her swell with a cold that felt older than love. She knew he would not rest until he tore Arminius from her, even if it meant burning their entire world. She kept silent, hoping to avert the inevitable, hoping that blood might still hold. But blood had become poison between them. Spring came, and with it the Roman tide. Germanicus surged across the Rhine with legions gleaming, auxiliary cavalry sweeping ahead like steel wind. Villages burned in their wake, fields blackened, the tribes scattered before him, not even daring to feign unity. Arminius scrambled to rally his warriors, but every council broke into shouting. Even his most loyal companions argued, fearful of Rome's size, its hunger, its immortal machinery. In that vacuum of fear, Segestes struck. One night, while Arminius was away gathering warriors among the Bructeri, Segestes rose in open defiance with a band of loyalists. They surrounded the hall where Thusnelda stayed, heavy with child, and demanded she return to her father's house. She stood at the threshold, hair unbound, her hand on the swell of her belly, and refused. Her voice was quiet but sharp as a blade. She would not crawl back, not as daughter, not as hostage, not as spoil. Segestes did not argue. He gave the signal. His men surged forward. They tore her from her hall like wolves dragging down a stag. Her handmaids were cut down, the hearth overturned. She was bound, her wrists bruised by rope, her protests drowned in the crash of splintering timbers. She did not scream. She bit her tongue and let the copper taste of blood fill her mouth rather than give them the sound of her fear. By dawn, she was in Segestes' camp, a prisoner in her father's tent, guarded like treasure and watched like a threat. Germanicus arrived within days, his banners rippling black and crimson against the pale spring sky. He greeted Segestes as an ally, clasping the old man's hands as if they were brothers, though both knew their pact was built from betrayal. When he saw Thusnelda, his gaze flickered with something colder. Curiosity sharpened into triumph. She stood tall despite the ropes at her wrists, her belly heavy, her hair tangled from the struggle. She met his eyes without flinching. In that moment, she became more than a prisoner. She became a trophy. Germanicus ordered her taken under guard to the Rhine, to be transported to Rome as living proof that the rebel wolf had been defanged, that even his bloodline knelt beneath the eagle. The soldiers marveled at her composure as she was led away. She walked as if the earth rose to meet her feet. She spoke to no one. News reached Arminius like a spear driven through his chest. He returned to find her gone, his hall half burned, her footprints erased by the rain. Witnesses spoke in fragments. Segestes, the night, the Roman banners cresting the hills. Arminius stood in the wreckage, silent, while his warriors shouted for vengeance. He did not move. His face was carved stone. Only his hands betrayed him, clenched so tightly the knuckles split and bled. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice low and cold, stripped of all humanity. He swore before the gods that he would tear Segestes apart with his bare hands, that he would rip the child from Roman chains, burn their forts to ash, scatter their legions like chaff. His rage was not fire, it was ice, and it began to freeze the men around him. Even his closest allies stepped back, uneasy, as if they were seeing a man become something more and less than human. But rage could not conjure unity. His call to arms echoed into emptiness. Tribes who had cheered his triumph now shrank from his desperation, unwilling to gamble their fragile survival against Rome's wrath. He struck back where he could, ambushes in the marshes, raids on Roman outposts, but they were splinters against a stone wall. Germanicus crushed the Marsi, burned their sacred groves, marched deep into the land with iron discipline, and Thusnelda was gone. She traveled under heavy guard, down the Roman roads, the forest receding behind her like a dying dream. She said nothing as the carts rattled over stone bridges, through garrison towns, past the staring faces of conquered peoples. She watched the land change, wild hills flattening into Roman order, fields squared like chessboards, temples gleaming white in the sun. Each mile felt like a layer of herself being peeled away, yet she clung inwardly to a stillness that Rome could not touch. At the port, she was placed on a galley bound for the Mediterranean. Salt wind tangled her hair. The sea spread endless and blue beneath a sun too bright to bear. Somewhere behind that horizon, Arminius raged in the dripping forest, howling her name into the void. She heard him in dreams, distant and broken, like thunder too far to shake the earth. When she reached Rome, they did not cage her in chains. They dressed her in fine linen, fed her honeyed wine, and guarded her as one guards a sacred relic. She was no longer a woman, she was a symbol, the proof that even the fiercest of the forest could be bent, that the blood of rebellion could be paraded through marble streets as spectacle. She gave birth to her son, Tumellus, under the vaulted ceilings of a Roman villa. Far from the earth she had once pressed her palms against to hear the heartbeat of her gods. She wept only once silently, as he was taken from her to be raised as a Roman. In Germania, Arminius fought on. He struck where he could, bleeding Germanicus's patrols, ambushing supply lines, refusing to yield even as the odds crushed in around him. But something had been torn from him more vital than any fortress. The forest still sheltered him, but its whispers sounded hollow. Without her, he was no longer a man building a future. He was only a shadow clawing at the ruins of what might have been. Rome celebrated. Germanicus returned to the capital to thunderous ovation, hailed as the avenger of Teutoburg, and in his triumphal parade before the cheering multitudes marched Thusnelda, not in chains but in silence. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, her face pale and still as marble. The crowd roared. She did not hear them. She walked as if through snow, as if every step carried her deeper into a tomb. She had once been the heart of a rebellion. Now she was Rome's ornament. And somewhere beyond the mountains, her name became a curse on Arminius's lips, the wound he could never close. The forest no longer spoke to him. Once its whispers had wrapped around Arminius like a second heartbeat. It had been his refuge, his shield, his co-conspirator, its shadows carrying his warriors, and its silence holding their secrets. But now, when he stood among the ancient oaks, he felt nothing. No presence, no pulse, only emptiness, vast and echoing, as though something sacred had turned its face away. They had taken her from him. Thusnelda, his anchor, his flame, the soul that had steadied his hand when his fury threatened to consume his reason, was gone, carried off by the empire he had once dared to wound. She had been more than his wife. She had been the bridge between what he had been and what he could become, between the forest's wildness and the discipline Rome had burned into his bones. Without her, his world had no center. At first, he tried to transform grief into war. He hurled his fury at the empire with the desperation of a starving wolf. He stalked Roman columns like a shadow, ambushed patrols in the bogs, burned their supply depots, slaughtered their messengers. Germanicus, for all his brilliance, could never pin him down. Arminius became mist, appearing from nowhere and vanishing back into the dark before Roman swords could bite air. Roman soldiers muttered his name as a curse. Some swore the forest itself moved for him, opening to swallow him whole when they gave chase. But the victories rang hollow. They always had. Now they tasted like ash. Each triumph brought no joy, only a flare of rage followed by the same crushing void. His warriors began to sense it, the way his eyes glazed after battle, the way he stood over Roman corpses as if trying to remember why their deaths mattered. He no longer celebrated, no longer roared victory to the sky. He fought as if trying to tear a hole in the world large enough to find her again. The tribes watched him with wary eyes. Once they had followed him because he made them believe Rome could bleed. Now they whispered that he had gone mad, that the loss of his wife had cracked his mind. Even his own kin began to keep their distance. He stopped eating with them, stopped feasting, stopped speaking unless to give orders. He prowled his halls at night like a restless specter, unable to sleep, unable to be still. Grief hollowed him, and suspicion filled the hollow. He began to see betrayal in every pause, every glance. He accused his rivals of plotting with Rome, then his allies, then even his cousins. He spoke less and less in the old tongue, lapsing unconsciously into the clipped Latin of his youth, as if Rome's language had slithered back to claim him. His warriors shifted uneasily when he spoke, unsure if they were following a leader or fleeing a ghost. And all the while, far away under a foreign sun, Thusnelda endured. Rome treated her not as a prisoner, but as a curiosity. They placed her in a marble villa overlooking the Tiber, ringed with gardens and guarded by silent soldiers who watched her as one might watch a caged lion. She was not beaten, not starved, not mocked. That would have been easier. They did something worse. They were kind. They spoke gently, offered her honeyed figs and soft linens, as if trying to convince her she had always belonged to them. They wanted her to vanish into comfort, to dissolve like salt in warm water. She refused. She rose each morning before the city stirred, standing at the terrace as the dawn bled, rose and gold across the river. She did not speak of home. She did not speak of Arminius. She let Rome wrap her in its finery like spider silk and pretended not to feel the threads. But inside she kept the forest alive. She closed her eyes and walked its shadows in her mind. The damp earth, the groaning branches, the breath of moss. She carried it like a secret ember in her ribs. Her son, Thumelius, was taken from her almost immediately. They told her it was for his good, that he would be raised as a Roman, given tutors and baths and clean sandals, that he would grow to be civilized. She did not weep where they could see. She only nodded, then watched as they carried him away down a colonnade of marble pillars, his small cries echoing until they vanished. That sound carved a hollow in her soul that never closed. In time, Rome grew bold enough to display her. When Germanicus returned from his campaigns, the city erupted in celebration. He was hailed as the avenger of Teutoburg, the purifier of Roman honor. The Senate granted him a triumph, the highest glory Rome could offer, a parade through the heart of the capital for the entire city to witness. And in that triumph, amid the wagons heaped with spoils and the chained Germanic captives, they placed Thusnelda. She was dressed in pale silk, her hair braided with gold, her face painted in the Roman style. She walked at the head of the Germanic prisoners, unbound, her spine straight as a spear. The crowd howled its approval, showering flowers, roaring Roman chants that drowned the air. She did not flinch. She did not bow. She did not smile. She walked as if through snow, as if each footstep were cracking ice beneath her. Her gaze never wavered, fixed on some point far beyond the cheering multitudes, as though she were already halfway gone from this world. They wanted to see her broken. She gave them something colder. Indifference. Arminius never saw it. He only heard the tales carried north by traitors and deserters, that his wife had been paraded through Rome's marble streets like a tamed beast. When he heard, something inside him died. He did not rage. He did not speak. He only stood for hours in silence, staring at the horizon as if trying to see across the mountains, the plains, the sea, all the way to the marble tomb that had swallowed her. After that, he stopped trying to unite the tribes. He stopped speaking of freedom or future. He became only the blade, nothing more. He struck at Rome because it was the only thing left to strike. His warriors followed because they feared him, not because they believed. He had become what he once despised, a creature of pure destruction, stripped of hope. Without Thusnelda's voice beside his, he had no reason to build, only to burn. Seasons turned. Rome withdrew behind its walls along the Rhine, building stone fortresses, digging deep ditches, planting its border like a wall of teeth. Germanicus was recalled to Rome, his victories celebrated, his failures buried beneath marble praise. The legions no longer dreamed of conquest beyond the river. The empire's horizon had retreated, and yet Arminius fought on, alone in spirit even when surrounded by men, as if he could not stop even though he no longer knew why. The forest, which had once sung to him, now only listened. And somewhere far to the south, Thusnelda stood on her terrace as the Tiber slid past like molten gold, her eyes on the northern wind, waiting for a message that would never come. By the time the leaves turned gold again, Arminius no longer cast a shadow. He moved through his halls like smoke, insubstantial, half real. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of thousands, who had torn 3 Roman legions from the earth like weeds, was now a solitary figure adrift inside his own legend. His warriors still followed him, or said they did, but only out of habit, not devotion. They had seen what he had become. Not a leader, not a liberator, but a scar. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was of vengeance in words worn thin from overuse. He fought not to win, not even to survive, but because stopping would mean facing the silence waiting for him in every corner of the forest. He had no victories left that mattered. Rome had stopped trying to reclaim Germania. They had built their wall along the Rhine, dug their ditches, raised their stone watchtowers like clenched teeth, and settled into patience. The empire did not need to conquer him anymore. It only needed to wait, knowing time was their strongest legion. Arminius, once the nightmare that haunted their dreams, had become to them what they had always been to him, a distant rumor, a fading echo, and without Thusnelda, there was nothing left to hold him to the world of the living. She lingered in his mind like mist. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, certain he had heard her voice outside the longhouse, soft and steady as ever, only to find the doorway empty, the wind threading cold fingers through the firs. He spoke to her sometimes under his breath, as if the forest might carry the words to her across the mountains and the sea. He told her of the battles he no longer believed in, of the forest's silence, of the sun he had never held. He spoke not as if she could answer, but as if her ghost were the only thing still listening. But even ghosts grow tired of grief. Desperation began to twist his mind into new shapes. If he could not unite the tribes through victory, perhaps he could do it through fear. If they would not follow him willingly, they could be compelled. He began to speak of kingship, an unthinkable word in Germania, where chieftains ruled only by the consent of their peers, and kingship was considered tyranny. He spoke of forging the tribes into one nation, with himself at its apex, a crown of iron and blood. The very word king made the elders flinch like scorched hounds. They remembered the Rome he had once worn like a second skin, the way he spoke their tongue with a Roman cadence, the way he still carried himself like a centurion. Now they saw not a liberator, but a usurper, a would-be Caesar draped in wolfskins. Even his kin recoiled. The nobles of the Cherushi gathered in secret, men who had once knelt to his commands now whispering as equals again. They said he had lost the favor of the gods, that his grief had curdled into madness, that he would drag them all into ruin if he were allowed to bind their freedom into his personal crown. They remembered the boy taken from them in chains, raised in Rome's shadow, and saw only a Roman in a barbarian mask. They spoke of ending him. Word of their plotting trickled back to him in fragments, but he dismissed it. He had grown numb to treachery, seeing it everywhere until it no longer registered as danger. He believed they would not dare. He had forgotten the oldest rule of power. When fear rots into contempt, death is close behind. The knives came in autumn. The leaves were dying, crisping to copper when they struck. He was returning from a hunt, alone, walking through the grove where he and Thusnelda had once bound themselves to each other. The air smelled of wet moss and cold iron. The sun was sinking behind the oaks, bleeding gold between the trunks. They were waiting. They stepped from the trees without a word. His cousins, his fellow nobles, men whose oaths still hung like ashes in the air between them. For a moment they hesitated, faces pale, as if the weight of his legend pressed against their spines. Then the first blade slid between his ribs. He made no sound. The second struck lower, severing the strength from his legs. He staggered, his hands grasping for a sword that was not there. The forest tilted. He fell to one knee, breath rattling. They came closer, silent as carrion birds. The third knife entered his throat. He did not die like a hero. He did not roar defiance or curse their names. He only sank slowly to the earth, eyes lifting once more toward the canopy, as if trying to see through it, trying to glimpse the ghost of her face in the fading light. For an instant, the wind stirred the leaves and he thought he heard her voice. Soft, steady, calling his name the way she once had when the world was still whole. Then the sound faded and the forest closed over him. They left his body where it fell, lying among the moss like a broken idol. The man who had destroyed 3 legions died not at the hands of Rome, but by the knives of his own blood. No funeral was held. No mound was raised. The forest devoured him, as it devours everything in time. Far away, Thusnelda did not know. No messenger came. No whisper reached her across the marble distance. She lived still in her Roman villa, silent as a statue. Her eyes distant, the fire in her chest banked to embers. Her son, Thumelius, was growing up Roman, speaking Latin, wearing the white toga of a citizen child, taught to laugh at the savagery of the tribes that had birthed him. Sometimes she saw him in the gardens, chasing butterflies between the trimmed hedges, and for a moment her heart surged as if he might remember something of the forest in his blood. He never did. She never spoke Arminius' name again. But at night when the villa slept and the river murmured outside the colonnades, she would stand barefoot on the cold tiles and look north. The wind from Germania reached her sometimes, faint and wild, carrying the scent of pine and rain. She would close her eyes and imagine the forest as it had been before Rome stole her from it. The sacred grove where she had once pressed her hand to the earth and felt the deep heartbeat of the land. She imagined him there, waiting. She let herself believe it, just for a moment. Then she opened her eyes and the marble was still cold beneath her feet. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, the forest stood silent, and beneath its dripping boughs, the man who had defied an empire lay forgotten, his name already fading into myth. Rome forgot her slowly. At first, Thusnelda was spoken of in the same breath as Arminius, the barbarian princess who had betrayed her Romanized father, the rebel's consort who had dared defy an empire, the beautiful prisoner paraded in Germanicus's triumph like a jewel torn from the dark. Senators whispered her name as a cautionary tale. Roman matrons spoke of her beauty as if it were a crime. Poets sketched her silhouette in verses meant to glorify Roman vengeance. But Rome is a river that washes everything smooth, and soon her name was worn down like a stone left in its current. The city that had once gawked at her grew bored. Germanicus moved on to new victories, then to new intrigues, then to his own death, mourned as a hero while she went unmentioned. The senators stopped including her in their speeches. The crowd stopped whispering when she passed in her guarded villa, and she let them forget. She spent her days in silence watching her son grow into a creature she barely recognized. Thumelius was quick, sharp, beautiful in the way of marble statues. Every motion precise, every word polished. He spoke Latin as if he had been born from the Tiber itself. He did not remember the forest. He did not know the language she had whispered into his ear before Rome tore him from her. She watched him chase peacocks through the garden colonnades, watched him spar with wooden swords under the eyes of Roman tutors, watched him recite Virgil with perfect diction. Each time he smiled in triumph, her heart clenched, torn between pride and mourning. He was the child of 2 worlds, yet belonged to neither. Too Roman to return to the forest, too wild in his blood to ever truly belong to marble. And she could not tell him who he was. Rome had forbidden it. They had erased Arminius from every tale he was allowed to hear. To speak the name was to risk reminding the child that he was born of defiance. So she stayed silent, her love becoming a secret she carried like a wound. The years passed, her hair silvered, the seasons blurred into a muted haze of sunlight and stone. Sometimes she walked alone by the river at dawn, when the city still slept and the world seemed thin enough that she might see through it. She would press her hand to the earth, as she had once done in the sacred grove, and try to feel the old heartbeat of the land. It never came. The marble was cold and still. News reached her sometimes in fragments, whispers carried by traitors, rumors too faint to trust. She heard that Arminius had died, but not how, not when. The Romans who mentioned him spoke with a shrug, as if he were only a forgotten bandit. They did not say he had once annihilated 3 legions. They did not say he had changed the course of their empire. They said only that he was gone. She did not weep. She had no tears left. She only stood a little longer on the terrace that night, staring into the dark until the stars blurred and the river below looked like the shadow of something enormous moving beneath the earth. When Thumelicus came of age, Rome cast him on stage like a mask. They enrolled him in the gladiatorial games at Ravenna, mocking his bloodline under the guise of spectacle. They called him the barbarian prince, laughed when he fought, laughed when he fell. He died there, cut down for sport before a crowd of jeering Romans. Thusnelda never saw him again. When the news reached her, it came not as a message but as absence. The villa emptied of his laughter, the garden silent. She said nothing. She did not rage. She did not mourn. Something deeper than grief settled over her, cold and absolute, like snow on a battlefield long abandoned. No one recorded when she died. No monument bears her name. She slipped from Rome's memory the way mist slips from a river at sunrise, leaving nothing behind but damp stone. And yet, though Rome forgot, the forest did not. In Germania, the trees grew back over the bones of the legions Arminius had destroyed. The roads crumbled, the forts rotted, the Rhine hardened into Rome's border, and beyond it the land remained free, wild, unconquered. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell like tides, and still the forest stood, vast and patient, holding their names in its silence. Long after Rome was ash, travelers spoke of a woman who had defied her father and her empire, and of the man she had followed into legend. They said the wind and the oaks still whispered their voices, that if you stood alone in the sacred grove at dusk, you could hear them, not as ghosts, not as saints, but as something older, as if the forest itself remembered the moment 2 human hearts had burned bright enough to wound an empire. It is said that love cannot topple empires, and yet for 3 days in the dripping dark, it did. They shattered Rome's legions, and Rome erased their names. They lost everything, and in losing became eternal. The marble forgot them. The forest never will.